Cool. All right. Well, why don't we get started here? Let me just move that down. So, hey everybody. So, thanks very much for joining us today on our webinar. We're really excited to have you. We hope you're all doing very well. Today we're going to talk about foundational skills and team diving principles. So these are essentially, this is a platform that we've used here at Ocean Quest for many, many years to really frame all of our training around. So whether you've taken an open water course with us or an advanced course or anything else, you've probably seen a lot of these principles integrated into the training outside of what's often added from the outlines that we get from the training agencies such as PADI. So for us, it really makes training a lot more interesting because it gives us an opportunity to add our own little flair to what we want to do. But really what we do is we see the results of this type of these concepts apply to the divers, and the fact that they come out, I think, a lot better skilled and a lot more have a lot more awareness and those types of things. Okay, so we're going to take a look at foundational skills. How do foundational skills affect safety, and what is the difference between buddy diving and team diving? And as we go through this is just really a quick overview. There's a lot more details that we would cover if we were running a program, but this should give you a good idea of some of these concepts and how they apply to diving. And if you've taken training with us and you've seen these before, then it's a good way to kind of get refreshed and maybe pick up a few new tips. And if you haven't seen these before, maybe it's something that's interesting to you, and you can find that you can start to maybe integrate or seek out these concepts and add them to your diving. So to start off, I'll just talk a little bit about myself. If you don't know me, my name is Greg McCracken. I'm the co-owner of Ocean Quest. So Deirdre and I have been running Ocean Quest now for almost 25 years. We are very happy and proud to be part of the Vancouver diving industry, and we try to be as active as possible. We both still dive and are involved actively for fun. I'm also a PADI instructor trainer, and I'm also a technical instructor trainer through PADI, and I still actively teach a lot of the different programs, and I've been doing so for over 25 years. So a lot of these concepts that we're going to discuss are actually what makes teaching still exciting for me even after all these years, because it really gives something personal that we can add to the training to make it individual for the person that's taking it, because you'll find that a lot of divers will progress at different rates, and so we can always kind of take a snapshot of where people are at based on where they are with their level of diving, and try to get them to get up another notch on their diving abilities and so forth. So foundational skills are essentially the knowledge and skills that you need to be a safe and efficient diver. And so it's really a platform that you build upon. And we'll discuss how that works in a little bit here. The more solid your foundational skills are, then the safer you'll be as a diver. And ultimately, you're going to have a lot more fun. And that's really, I mean, we always think about safety for diving, but when we're diving, we really want to have fun, and the more safe you are, obviously, the more controlled in the water, the more efficient you are, then ultimately you're going to have a lot more fun. So from a knowledge standpoint, a good place to always start is configuration, and so of your equipment, and you'll find that the type of equipment that you use and how you configure it can often really make a big difference on how you dive. And so it could be just a simple thing as where is your pressure or your depth gauge put, or your dive computer. Do you put it on a console or do you put it on a wrist? There's pros and cons to both, but you'll find that when you configure something to a certain style of diving, that you'll find that it's really important to have the equipment set up this certain way. You'll also want to be, of course, nice and streamlined, and you'll see in the picture here that there's no danglies on this diver here. And so, there's nothing to drag on the bottom or make your diving inefficient. without being streamlined, those types of things. It's very clean, and those are all aspects that we look at for equipment configuration. Of course, we can also add specialized equipment with that as well, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Communication is also, of course, a really important part of diving. And when we look at it from a foundational standpoint, then we want to make our communication clear and concise and effective. And if everybody in the diving team doesn't really understand what you're trying to communicate, then obviously there's a breakdown. And so learning common signals that are used, using lights for communication in different ways are all parts of this foundation and team diving kind of approach. One of the other things that you notice right away, especially as local divers, is we always have something in our hands. Often it's a light, maybe down the road it's a GoPro, maybe you're getting into wreck diving, you're carrying a light and a reel. So you have all these things that you're dealing with. So we try to move towards one-handed communications. So you'll see on the screen here again, here's a list of one-handed communications for numbers. You'll find that there's a whole array of signals that we can use that are standardized from an international community standpoint that you can use with one hand and communicate more effectively to your team members. And then team diving principles. So we'll again talk a little bit more about team diving at the end here, but if you take a quick look at this picture, it really illustrates some of the key aspects of team diving that we try to approach in our training. So these guys are obviously they're technical divers, but we utilize the same techniques for all divers, but they're ascending and they're in a triangle formation so they can each see each other. And you'll notice that their lights are out, their heads are up, so communication is really easy. They're also all at the same depth level, so again, they can maintain that communication and that effective team contact. And then dive planning. So there's lots of different things that we do when we consider dive planning, and in some cases, dive planning is really easy. So a lot of us local divers have been to Wycliffe Park dozens and dozens of times. And we dive with the same buddies all the time. So in that case, you know, just planning a nice, simple, fun dive is really easy. And there might not be a lot of logistics to go through. But as you decide to do more complicated types of diving, maybe there's roles involved in the divers and the people that you're diving with, then all of a sudden dive planning can be more complex. And so if you have an objective, like you're doing a research dive, or maybe you're doing a wreck penetration dive, or even just going out and one of the dive buddies is taking pictures and the other one's not, then all of a sudden that adds a little bit of complication to the plan. And you want to make sure that you communicate how you're going to work together to complete that objective. Gas planning. So there's lots of different ways to plan your gas, and one of the things that sometimes people don't consider when they're doing gas planning is just a simple gas reserve that you need to ascend with your buddy in case they need to share air with you from the deepest part of your dive, or if you're in a situation where you have to get to an exit in an overhead environment, then of course you need to have a gas reserve to get to that exit with another diver while sharing air, and even to the surface after that. So learning how to do a proper gas plan is actually a really important skill, especially if you're going to start to dive, you know, in that 30-meter, 100-foot range, because it does take a little bit longer to get to the surface, and you need to make sure you have enough gas. When we do this in class, a lot of people are surprised that even if you have a fairly good breathing rate, when you're diving with an 80 cubic foot cylinder, you'll need about 12 or 1300 psi to get 2 people to the surface, including a safety stop. Just a quick sidebar with a safety stop, you know, that's another discussion that sometimes we would have, whether or not people should do a safety stop or not when you're doing an ascent from that depth. But if you're an experienced diver and you're in control, then by all means you can. But if you're not sure, then we would suggest that you just actually omit the safety stop and then just head straight to the surface, because if you're in an emergency situation, the surface is definitely the safest place to be. Another good part of your foundational knowledge would be the effects of nitrogen and carbon dioxide. And so nitrogen is pretty common for us to talk about in diving. We obviously all know it relates to decompression sickness. We know that it relates to narcosis. It's just one of the participating gases for narcosis, but nonetheless, we always think of nitrogen in that capacity. But a lot of times we don't think about the carbon dioxide aspect of diving. And the reality is that we bring carbon dioxide with us on every dive, and the reason for that is because it's a byproduct of metabolizing oxygen. So every single time we breathe in oxygen and our body metabolizes, it creates carbon dioxide, which we have to get rid of. Now on the surface, of course, it's not much of an issue, but underwater, when we have a regulator, we're creating a dead airspace there. When we start to dive a little bit deeper and we're having denser gas, all of these things can make us more susceptible to retaining carbon dioxide. And so a diver should be familiar with the effects of CO2 as well as maybe some of the symptoms, just in case they are. If you're swimming against a current or working really hard underwater, then it's very easy to build up CO2. And some of the symptoms could be pretty simple. It can cause narcosis, so it contributes with the nitrogen and oxygen that we're breathing from a narcotic standpoint. It can make you lightheaded. It can make you confused, and in extreme situations, it can even cause a diver to become unconscious. And those are very extreme situations, and often people are very, very deep. But nonetheless, it is something that, again, you need to be aware of. Some people have had some effects on CO2 and have actually, without even recognizing it, and if you've ever had a headache after a deep dive, for example, usually that's resulting from some type of CO2 retention. It's obviously very mild, but not very comfortable at the same time. Another thing, just from a knowledge standpoint, is discussing common diving emergencies. And the thing about diving that's really good is the fact that most of the things that can happen underwater are very predictable. You know, thinking about sharing air, well, you know, somebody can run out of air, which is a human air type of problem, which obviously we try to avoid, and I think most of us do a good job with that. But we can also have some equipment problems that might relate to a loss of air, like a catastrophic gas failure. So that could be like an O-ring blowing on a cylinder, it can be a hose blowing, it could be a second stage free flow or something like that. But nonetheless, that's a predictable thing. Like, we know that that can happen. And because of that, we also know how to resolve that problem. And it could be simply by sharing air with our buddy. And in that case, we need to make sure that we're staying close enough to our team to share air if we need to. And we have that gas reserve that we talked about. Also, it could be something like bringing a redundant gas source. So maybe you decide to dive doubles or side mount or carry an extra redundant cylinder with you while you're diving. So that can obviously resolve that problem as well. Other problems that we can have that are very predictable, you know, we can have mask strap breaks, so you might need to have a spare mask with you. You can have a BCD or a dry suit inflate automatically. So some of these things are mitigated by proper servicing. Some of them maybe by doing a proper check before you go diving and making sure that your equipment's functioning properly. But nonetheless, these are things that are predictable, and we can plan for them. And therefore, if we can plan for them, that means we can practice them as well. And so discussing them from a theory standpoint is important, but then going out and using that theory to actually apply to practicing and getting good at handling those problems means that when they actually do happen, they're very easy to resolve, versus never practicing an out of air situation. And then, you know, one day, you know, maybe you're not even the person that's out of air, but you're the one that's helping somebody. And because you haven't practiced it, you're rusty, and it creates a lot more stress, and often will escalates the problem versus solving it. So foundational skills. So when we're looking at the skills, obviously the one that we're all always working towards is good quality buoyancy control. So this is something that we start off at the open water level, and I think it doesn't take too long to get a reasonable handle on buoyancy. but you'll find that as you progress as a diver, the more things that you're exposed to, you'll actually find that good quality buoyancy, especially when you're task loaded, can actually be very, very challenging to achieve. And so, so one of the things in training that we like to do is move people towards that kind of that type of buoyancy where they don't have to think about it. It's second nature, even when they're task loaded. And I'll show you a couple examples of that later on. Proper trim. So a good trim is horizontal. We always like to say your head's up so you have good awareness to your dive buddies as well as the environment, and then your fins are up as well, so you can not start the bottom and also maybe not damage marine life, those types of things. So you're more controlled. And this picture here is actually, I'll just give a little kudos. This is my daughter and Deirdre's, mine and Deirdre's daughter, Caitlin. And this is her 6th dive in Hawaii last year. And so she really took these skills seriously when she was learning, and she mastered skills like good trim and propulsion and stuff like that fairly early on. And she's now diving locally too. Propulsion. So a lot of times when we talk about propulsion, we're looking at frog kicking, we're talking about modified flutter kicks and all sorts of things, helicopter turns, backwards finning. This short video here is really, it's kind of demonstrating those to some degree, but really what propulsion is about is really giving you control underwater. So the fin kicking techniques that we often teach aren't necessarily designed so you only do those. It's really so you can utilize those as a tool to maneuver underwater. So with good propulsion, you can move forwards, you can move backwards, you can go up, you can go down, you can rotate, and you can stop whenever you want. You can maintain position. So there's a lot of little incidentals with propulsion and little fin movements that we like to do. But of course, propulsion is really related to the fins, and there should be no hand movement, at least non-deliberate hand movement. Occasionally, if you're wanting to move and you want to kind of just move your hand over just a one little swoosh, that's fine. But when people are waving around uncontrollably, it actually creates a lot more problems with your buoyancy and your platform. As earlier discussed, we talked about emergency skills. And so here's an example of a technical diving program where we practice manifold failures as one of our examples. And so this person has a simulated manifold failure off their left side. And so because, again, this is a predictable problem that we can have, it allows us to simulate the problem in training, so that way the divers get a chance to practice it. And you can see that we try to make it realistic. We have lots of bubbles, it's very noisy, and the divers have to learn how to shut down their valves and so forth to handle the problem. And the other thing when we talk about team diving is you can see that there's another diver in front, and that person isn't jumping in to help the diver with the problem. We want to be self-reliant, but at the same time, they're there to kind of, again, maintain some stability to the situation, offer help or assist the diver if the problem diver requests for help, so they'll actually call the diver in. And then they can also be a second set of eyes, especially if you have a problem behind your back. You can't, of course, see there, so they might be able to verify what's going on and so forth, but you still ultimately are responsible for handling it on your own. Okay, so how do foundational skills affect safety? So during 2010 Dive Fatalities Workshop hosted by Divers Alert Network, they addressed 5 significant root causes that contributed to diving accidents. So, so back in 2010, Dan worked with a bunch of other major training agencies, and they compiled all sorts of recreational level diving accidents and fatalities. And they wanted to essentially examine, what caused these things. And obviously the main goal is how do we focus our training and our skills and so forth to help avoid these accidents from happening. So the 5 areas that they addressed that were involved in the majority of diving fatalities were pre-existing conditions. And so it's actually been known for quite some time that 25 to 35% of diving fatalities are related to cardiovascular disease. So, so you will find that sometimes divers just have heart problems, and that is a major contributing factor to the accident. So for us, what we would have to do is have a self-examination here and say, okay, am I in that category? And if I am, then what should I be doing to keep myself safe? So I obviously can go see the doctor and get checkups regularly if I'm an active diver. Perhaps I try to increase my exercise and strengthen my cardiovascular system, you know, those types of things. So so you can take a look. If I have bad habits like smoking, maybe I would want to quit those, because we can see that they're contributing factors to this. Poor buoyancy control. So here you can see an example of some divers struggling with their buoyancy, and we all know we have to start somewhere. So it's definitely no judgment on people when they're starting with their diving skills, but the having the mindset to wanting to improve your buoyancy and actually practice and work on those skills is really important. You can see just from that quick example that poor buoyancy, you know, can cause you know, other problems like silt out when you're close to the bottom. It can be harder to keep track of the people you're diving with. If you're diving on a bottom or on a dive site that doesn't have a bottom, then obviously controlling your buoyancy and maintaining a safe depth might be challenging. And obviously buoyancy control during the point of your ascent might be also a big challenge if you can't control the rate of your ascent and you end up doing a rapid ascent. So we obviously want to make sure that we continue to work towards our buoyancy control. Rapid ascent or violent water movement. So here's a quick example of actually both. You'll notice that there's quite a lot of wave movement on the plumose there, but this diver got caught in an upwelling, so a little bit of a violent water type situation. Upwellings aren't very common, but nonetheless they do occur in different parts of BC. Again, we kind of know those sites well enough and usually try to plan them. The backstory here is I was diving and I noticed the upwelling, and so I kind of anticipated that maybe some other divers might have problems, so I turned back and just in time to see this person struggling a little bit. So not only did the upwelling kind of cause them a challenge, but you can see that they actually lost a little bit of control of their positioning and ended up feet first. So so we also stopped a rapid ascent there in that situation too, and we managed to straighten the person out and we got out of the upwelling area, and then the dive site calmed down a little bit and was fine. And I don't know why I'm curious now. I'm just looking at this. It's a video. Did you see the video work? Let's see here. You can let me know, is that video working? Okay, good. That video was a bit longer, so it may have just went fast, but I shut it down a little bit because my practice run of this presentation was very long, and I hope that it doesn't go too long this time. So gas supply problems. So we talked a little about this already, but you know, obviously this is another one of the 5 contributing factors that Dan put out when they examined diving fatalities. And so running out of gas certainly is going to cause you some pretty big problems underwater. And so again, you know, we should be able to avoid running out of gas from the human error standpoint, because it really just is about being mindful and aware of our gas consumption and our gauges and so forth. But sometimes people can get caught, and this is now goes to the dive planning aspect. You know, if I'm on a wreck, for example, and I have an upline here, try to keep in the screen, but I'm along the wreck and I'm over here, some people may mismanage the amount of time it takes to get back to that upline. And so while they're swimming back to the upline here, they may get low or run out of gas on the way there. And some people don't think in those situations, they get a little bit stressed, and then they might bolt to the surface from that position or they might try to get to the upline and just swim faster and not make it in time. So really that kind of, yeah, when you look at your gas reserves, like how much time does it take to move to different parts of the site that you're going to and so forth are all really important. And then we can have equipment-related gas supply issues, again, with an O-ring going or maybe a reg free-flowing or something like that. And, and these are just making sure that you're comfortable with the air sharing procedures. The problem is that most people learn how to share air at their open water diver level, and then they actually don't practice again unless they're taking other courses that encourage them to. But if you look at experienced divers that are involved in, diving environments like overhead environment, like cave diving or wreck diving, or if you look at technical divers, they tend to practice air sharing almost every dive they go on, sometimes during a safety stop, or sometimes it's part of their pre-dive procedures. And of course, sometimes they do just practice dives and skills dives. And so these are divers that already learn these skills and they're always already very efficient at them. But we should really, as a community, be learning from that type of mentality at the early stages of diving to make sure that we practice those things more frequently. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of the concepts and some of the different things to think about in a little bit. Equipment problems. So here's another quick example. This wasn't a controlled situation, but just happened to notice that a din came loose on the regulator. Thought it'd be a good opportunity to show how to deal with it. So again, that's me, and I don't know the story behind it because that video is quite old, but nonetheless, you can see that there's no stress involved with that situation. In fact, I took the time to demonstrate and show the video camera what it looked like so we could kind of illustrate it in class. But that's the benefit of practicing and feeling comfortable with different problems when you can anticipate them and know how to deal with them. And so in that case, I have a redundant setup integrated with the doubles, so I could actually just turn that valve off and then switch to another regulator. So easy peasy. So many of these issues can be addressed through knowledge, skills, training, and experience. And so it always starts with a bit of a platform of knowledge, skills, and training. But the reality is that sometimes people focus too much on training and not enough on experience, or sometimes we see the opposite where people focus a lot on experience, but not a lot on training. So really it's all about balance, making sure that you have enough training, that your experience is comfortable and it's within your skill level, but you're not getting so much experience that you're developing maybe some bad habits that if you go back to training down the road, that you have to now kind of readjust or fix a bunch of things. And once we develop these muscle memory skills, sometimes it's hard to change them in our minds. So it's always good to kind of make sure you get a good balance of training and experience. Now, another quick note that's important to talk about is, we're addressing here some diving accidents and fatalities that Dan's examining and looking at major causes, but it's also worth noting that diving is still very, very safe. And in fact, even from statistics comparison to many other activities, even when we're looking at fatalities, not just injuries, diving is much safer than a lot of activities that you might even be surprised about, like running, for example. And so 0.472 fatalities per 100,000 dives is what they have based on 947 incidents between 1992 and 2003. So diving is still very safe, but nonetheless, we always want to make it safer. And there's definitely very easy ways that we can do so just through proper mentality, training, and so forth. So as a general statement, I think there's a couple main skills that we always encourage people to be current with. So one of them is reg recovery. So obviously, our regulators are life support. And so if we don't have the regulator in our mouth, then it's not offering that life support that we need. So, we will look at kind of the traditional reg recovery that you've learned in your entry-level course in a couple seconds. But some people will put a necklace around their primary regulator. So you can see in this picture, there's just a bungee loop. People will put that around their head and then their regulator's here. So in that case, regulator recovery should be really easy because if the reg for some reason drops out of my mouth, then I just go and put it back in. I don't have to do a sweep or do anything else. Now, it seems pretty straightforward, but sometimes we actually see people put the necklace on the wrong regulator. So if they have like a traditional configuration where it's a primary regulator with an octopus, sometimes we see that octopus around the neck like this. And I think people just happen to see other divers, pictures or videos on the internet, and they see that, the reg that they're breathing from doesn't have the necklace and the reg that they're not breathing from does. And that's from a long hose configuration primarily. So they just say, well, I'm not breathing from the octopus, so that's the one I'm going to put on. But the problem, of course, with that is if now I'm out of air and I'm going to come at you and I'm going to look at that octopus, that's the yellow regulator, I'm going to grab it from there and it's not releasable. It's actually around my neck, so it creates a bigger problem. And then likely my next step might be, if I'm not comfortable, is go to the actual one you're breathing from, which might be a satisfactory option in certain configurations, again, like long hose diving. But the problem in this situation is that hose is too short, so it's not going to be very easy to share air. So even something like simple, like putting a necklace around a reg, you definitely want to get some type of advice or integrate that with maybe a training program that you're doing, so you can kind of figure out the best ways to do it. Now here's our traditional reg recovery method, which is what we often call the sweep method. Now, again, when we learn how to do this in the open water course, in many cases, especially in the olden days, we'd be on our knees. So the method of sweeping is leaning over to the right and then trying to sweep around. But I don't dive on my knees, and neither do you. So the actual practical way of recovering the reg isn't the same. And so when you go out and practice these skills, make sure you're practicing them in a way that you dive. And so if you can do it while hovering horizontally, like you see in the video here, that's great. But if you can't, feel at this moment that you're really maintaining that stable platform, then do it while you're swimming, because that's also very realistic. So I'm swimming in a horizontal position, and then I can just take that regulator out and then practice. Now, anytime you're doing these types of skills, again, get your buddies involved. It's ideal to really do them with the supervision of an instructor, but if you want to do them on your own and you're comfortable with that, make sure your buddy knows what you're doing, so they can lend assistance if you need. Keeping in mind that regulator can be volatile depending on how you position it in the water. When you take a regulator out, you don't want to just toss it really hard, because the pressure on the back of the regulator can cause it to free flow. Obviously, you don't make it so the mouthpiece is faced up, because that will cause it to free flow. So there are some things to consider even when you're practicing these on your own, but nonetheless, we do think that it's a good idea that you practice these on a regular basis. Now, we also talked about alternate air source and practicing this on a regular basis. Another thing to look at is just the fact that there's a variety of procedures and configurations out there. And so, if I'm out of air, do I signal to you to share air, or do I just find the method of sharing air that you have? And if it's a traditional octopus, do I just find that octopus and do I grab it? People are trained to different methods or different philosophies with that respect. And so, so you have to think about, what philosophy works best for you, or what makes most sense in the situation. Also, there's a variety of configurations in the way that there's like Air 2 systems that are fitted to your BCD. So that's a regulator that's actually attached to the BCD inflator. And in that case, those divers often won't have an octopus, so they have to share air with their primary regulator, and then they breathe from the Air 2. So if you've never practiced that, then that's something, again, to consider. If you have a traditional octopus, how is it configured from the right-hand side or the left-hand side? And then, of course, we've talked a little bit about long hose configuration. And a long hose is basically a 7-foot long hose that the diver would have wrapped around their neck, and then breathing from here. And then they would have a shorter regulator around their neck like this. And so this one, the long hose that they're breathing from, would be the one that you would look for. And in that situation, the same thing. Now, what's the procedure? Do I give an out of air to that person because now they're breathing from it? And so that they should be trained to accept an out of air and then basically give you air efficiently. But at the same time, you should be able to still grab that regulator right from their mouth, and they should be comfortable with that as well. So lots of things to think about. Actually did kind of create a few videos for this that went into detail about the different configurations, but I found that it might have been a bit too long for this presentation. So I just uploaded them on YouTube on our channel. So at the end, maybe I'll throw it in the chat and you guys can take the link. It's very raw footage, so just accept it the way it is, but it does discuss these things in a little bit more detail. All right, so the last thing we talk about here is just if I'm diving with somebody and I don't recognize the way that their equipment's configured, then maybe I should have a quick discussion with them about how do we share air. So an easy example is I'm on the boat, maybe I'm in the tropics somewhere, and I'm looking around on the boat and I see a bunch of people with all sorts of different ways that they share air. Here I am by myself, and maybe they have us dive as a big group. So I should have a good understanding of how all of those configurations work in case I need to approach somebody underwater and give them that out of air signal. All right, so I didn't give you the answer on purpose here of what we think you should do, but I'm going to give you a little poll. There we go. See if this works. So what should you do if you signal out of air to another diver and they don't respond? Oh, look at that. Well, that's only 4 or 5. Oh, everybody else now is cheating because they can see how everybody else answered. But yes, so the answer would be secure the alternate air source on your own. So I can tell you that in different scenarios, I'll go up to people and I'll give them the out of air signal. Sometimes I'll even try to make it realistic. I'll have my rig out and I'll be like this, and I'll say, hey, I'm out of air. And what I get back from them is just simply a blank stare. It's like, huh? And they're like trying to really compute what's going on. It's not like they don't know what to do, but it really, because they don't practice, they just don't have that immediate response on how to handle that. So when we're teaching our brand new divers, and as that training continues to different things, we always teach people, especially with that traditional octopus configuration, that if you're out of air, then you go ahead and you grab that air, that you make sure that you can breathe, and then at that point you can communicate to the diver, hey, I'm out of air, and you can continue on the scenario or whatever you need to do afterwards. And that means that you're really taking control over your own situation there. All right. Of course, we talked again about buoyancy. So here's an example of some divers that we've had in our training program a while ago. And so they're demonstrating actually a lot of good things that we talked about. So really good buoyancy control. You can see they're really close to the bottom, but they're not touching it. They're not stirring it up. They're demonstrating really, really good trim. Their awareness is good. Their heads are up. Their feet are up. You can see that they're working well as a team of divers and so forth. So to get to this level, though, does take a lot of practice and a lot of experience and some guidance. But that's really a good example of a goal that you want to achieve there when you're looking at buoyancy control. So here's some tips that we have. Again, we're not inventing anything here, but sometimes it's good to have everything consolidated. So be weighted properly, do a buoyancy check at the beginning and at the end of your dive to encourage or ensure proper weighting. So some divers have a habit of overweighting themselves, and we actually hear this a lot even with instructors. But the real advice is to be properly weighted. Don't be overweighted. Now, some people might think that they're overweighted because you're weighting yourself for the end of the dive when your tanks are depleted, not at the beginning. So that means that by nature, you're always going to start a little bit negative because of that. But you should always end at the end. And that's why we always talk about buoyancy checks at the beginning and at the end. You obviously still have to have enough weight to get down at the beginning of the dive. And you should also make sure that you're not completely grossly overweighted. So a pre-dive buoyancy check would be good. And then once you kind of get those tanks a little bit more empty, then you can do a final check to make sure, and then start to really adjust the weighting based on that. Ideally, you should be able to hover at about 10 feet with a little, and locally with a little bit of air in our dry suit, comfortably, with, a reasonably low cylinder, no less than 500 PSI, but maybe in that range would be a good place to go. Now, obviously, once you have yourself weighted, you don't need to do anything different every single time you go diving. You have the same gear, but anytime you change something, whether it's an undergarment, or maybe you're adding a layer for winter diving, or maybe you're adding another item of equipment like a sling bottle of some sort, then clearly in those situations you want to make sure that you maybe double check your weighting and make sure that you're doing good. And maybe some of those early dives with new gear, you should just do something nice and simple, rather than planning like a deep dive where you're going to need to do a safety stop, and it's important for safety, because maybe you're going to be a little bit light at the end and then you pop up, and that might not be good for you. Another thing, of course, with buoyancy is using your lungs. So your lungs are really your main source of buoyancy when we're diving open circuit. And so if you use your BCD, or if you use your dry suit for your buoyancy, we basically use that to get us close to where you want to be, and then the lungs are really the fine tuning. And you should be able to actually use your lungs in a lot of variety of ways for your buoyancy too. So if I wanted to, for example, I want to raise up a little bit, I can actually fill up my lungs, but I can still breathe from the top of my lungs and actually still maintain that kind of elevated buoyancy for a temporary amount of time, and then I can exhale my lungs and get back to normal. Same thing as if I wanted to, maybe drop down a little bit, I can exhale my lungs, still breathe more or less from the bottom of my lungs, and then I can get back to normal again. So there's lots of different things. You can practice those things again, maybe at the end of the dive, or go out for a strict practice dive in the bay of Whitecliff or wherever, and you'll find that those things will be very, very helpful for you. Move slowly. If you move slowly, you'll feel more controlled underwater. So, one of the biggest things we see when we have divers come to us initially is that they move a lot, lots of, hand waving, lots of moving this way and that way, even flipping upside down towards the surface and then flipping back. So all of these things do affect your buoyancy. They affect obviously your trim. They affect your gas consumption, everything. So in general, the more controlled and the slower your movements are, the better. From just a strict buoyancy standpoint, here's some programs that are always very good to help improve your buoyancy. So, PADI Advanced course, of course, would be good, especially if it has the Peak Performance Buoyancy dive on it. The Peak Performance Buoyancy course clearly focuses on buoyancy, and here at Ocean Quest, we actually conduct this program on an individual basis. So, you can actually have one-on-one instruction, and the instructor will focus on your buoyancy and your skills. And this is the thing that we do when we run these types of programs. We still meet performance requirements of the outline, but at the same time, we're not just checking off boxes. We're not just going to get you to do a hover and get you to do a fin pivot and all these things and then just leave the water. We're really taking a look at you and making sure that we can help you get better with what you want to be better at. And we'll always throw in the fin kicking propulsion techniques and all those types of things. And then, if you are interested in the type of stuff that we're talking about here, you can look at the Foundations of Diving program, which is a program that we actually wrote here at Ocean Quest, and it's a PADI distinctive specialty, and it has a lot of really good theory, and it covers a lot of the stuff that we're discussing in more detail. It elaborates on things that we're not talking about, and then we go into the practical sense, and we really focus on buoyancy, we focus on trim, we do all the propulsion techniques. We have you practice all sorts of emergency situations, but in that neutral buoyancy team format. We focus on team diving. So there's a lot of really good aspects of that program, and it's really one of our favorite courses to teach, just because we find that it really helps evolve divers, and you can see their growth in the course, but we see it even more so after the course when they start applying some of the skills. All right, taking a look at proper trim. So just a quick little video that we have. So it's flat, horizontal trim, heads up, feet are up. And aside from the trim here, this is also just a skill that's very challenging, which is basically, we call it maintain position. So being able to hover and hold the position in the water column without a lot of movement. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Hello? People are chatting here, so I'm just trying to see. Oh, did I lose you now? My apologies. There we go. Oh, all right. Thank you. All right. So I'm not sure if you saw the trim video. I'm not going to show it again, but it's pretty straightforward, I think. All right, so the benefits of good trim and positioning. So by the way, like when we talk about trim, we would suggest that you stay in that horizontal position at every single part of your dive. So as soon as you descend, we're on the surface and we're kind of that, vertical position, but as soon as I descend, I deflate my BCD and I'm starting to sink, then I get myself into that horizontal trim. So literally I'm like a foot underwater or less, and now I'm horizontal. And then I'm descending down in that horizontal position. When I'm ascending, I ascend in that horizontal position, and only when I get right to the surface, then will I get myself back into that vertical position, of course, inflate my BCD and get some positive buoyancy. Now, I'll discuss why that is beneficial here in a second. So, but obviously good trim means you're more streamlined, which means it's less effort. And again, we swim horizontally, but how do you float when you stop swimming? Do you start to position yourself differently as you're doing that? So propulsion techniques. So this is now why in a descent formation or an ascent portion of the dive that I want to be horizontal as well, because when I'm horizontal, I can actually go down, I can go up, I can move forward, I can move backwards, and I can spin. Whereas if I'm upright like this and I want to move forward, well, then I have to put an effort in to get here and then go like this. And then sometimes when people turn around on a dive, they kind of flip back this way and then they kind of spin themselves around and then they go back down to that horizontal position. So you can see there's a lot of energy being utilized there. And so those are situations where, when you're just diving on your own and there's no problems or whatever, you're going through more air than maybe you want to, but it's not really a big issue. But if you develop those habits, then let's say now you're sharing air with somebody and now, there's a little bit more stress involved, and maybe there's a little bit more confusion and so forth. And next thing you know, divers are kind of popping up and down in a horizontal and vertical position and stuff and spinning around. Then obviously that creates a lot more stress to the situation itself, and there's not as much control, and it's not easy to maintain that awareness with the person that you're diving with. Better control in your dry suit. So obviously good trim is important there, because if I go vertical, well, all the air in my dry suit is going to come up, and then a lot of it might even burp out of my neck. If air comes out, then usually water comes in, so that's not comfortable. Obviously, if I flip the other way, my feet might fill with air, and then I can get an uncontrolled ascent to the surface there. So that good trim is going to be keeping you balanced, and once you have that, you can shift the air from one side of the suit to the other to even maintain different types of positioning as needed. Better work of breathing. So when you're horizontal, your lungs have the same amount of water pressure distributed throughout the whole length of them. Whereas again, when you're upright, then most of the water pressure is going to be on the bottom. So it just actually affects the way that your lungs will work and how easy it is to breathe. It may not be super noticeable, but again, in some situations it might be as well, especially if you're in an overexertion situation, swimming against a current, those types of things. And then lastly, better off-gassing. Same thing as with the lungs and work of breathing. So now if my lungs are having an equal amount of pressure then throughout the whole length of them, then they just tend to off-gas better. And again, it's probably not going to make a big difference in most divers' situation, but if you start getting into technical diving where we are deliberately going into decompression areas, then our off-gassing becomes really important, because if we don't off-gas effectively, then that might affect our safety. So the challenge for most divers is to maintain good buoyancy and trim while being task loaded or in a stressful situation. So in an open or in a course, we can't really always simulate stressful situations, but we certainly can give people task loading. So probably a great benchmark is SMB deployment. And so this is just one example of many that I have of videos with divers having challenges with their SMB. And this is of course normal. If you've ever used an SMB, you know that this is a challenge. But at the very beginning of the video, you can see he already started swimming away from his buddies. So now they don't have any control over them. And then, and he had to spin around a little bit. And then of course he ended up kind of flipping towards the surface and then ultimately lost his buoyancy. So common. Like, this is not, again, a judgment of anybody and their SMB performance, because all of these people that we show that had struggles, ended up doing very well by the end of their training. But this is where we all start when we're getting introduced to these skills. But if you really want to kind of test your ability to maintain trim and buoyancy and so forth while task loaded, FMB deployment is definitely one of the best ways to do it. So here's another example of good trim while being task loaded. And so at the very beginning, you may have noticed that the first thing that this person did is they actually made the okay sign to their team members. They even gave a little signal like, let's move forward. You notice that the person that's not doing the SMB moved slightly forward, so now they're in visual contact with each other. She's got her light out, so she's actually making sure that the person that's doing the SMB can see them, and they're now she's communicating to the other diver as well. So there's 3 people there. You can tell through the blur. And then the person that's doing the SMB is in good horizontal position. They're not swimming around. They're not moving around. The only thing that's really moving, are their hands. And now they've deployed the SMB without any issue. Now, again, this isn't their first time. This is after a lot of practice, but nonetheless, this is the goal. This is what you want to be able to achieve. All right, propulsion techniques. We talked lots about these, so I don't want to really over talk about them, but essentially we have a number of propulsion techniques that we want to practice and learn. We always start with a flutter kick when we're first learning, and really this is the most powerful type of kick that you can get. It also compensates when your buoyancy is not so good. So if my feet are dropping a little bit, then when I kick, I kind of get myself up. What we often see with brand new divers, they don't ever stop kicking. So, as they're going along, if we say stop, they'll stop, but then they'll be just kicking upright like this. And then we say, okay, come along. And then they go, oop, and then they keep going like that. So obviously we want to get people past that stage as soon as we can. So, moving from a flutter kick to what we call a modified frog kick actually would be ideal. Modified flutter kicks are useful in certain situations. Helicopter turns and backwards fin kicks. So we have a quick video that will show kind of all these different types of fin kicking techniques. Oops. Try that again. There you go. So this is what we call the modified frog kick. So instead of the actual frog kick, which is a lot more power and the full legs are in motion there, this is just more or less, from the knees up. The power is coming from the ankles and maybe the calves a little bit. And it's not supposed to be a powerful kick. And really, we're not trying to move very fast underwater. So it's just a nice, easy glide. So here's a helicopter turn, or sometimes we call them flat turns. So you can stay in that flat. Again, notice how close the diver is to the bottom. No silting, no disturbance or anything like that. Now, modified flutter kick. This one is useful more so when you're in tight spaces. So if I was sharing air with somebody, I'm tight with somebody else, then I'd probably go to this. If I'm in an overhead environment like a wreck dive and I'm swimming through a hallway, then I'd probably maneuver to that as well. And then here's the holy grail for most people, it's back finning. And so it's really the opposite of a frog kick. So a frog kick, I'm starting my power on the kind of the outwards motion, and then I bring my fins in. Well, in here, I'm actually starting on the inwards and I'm bringing them out. And so it's just as easy as that. So if you haven't, tried it, then just use those techniques and you'll get it like that. Anyway, so it is pretty challenging, but you'll find too, you have to have all the other components in there, like your buoyancy and your trim to really get effective. And as mentioned before, these finning techniques are really there as a combination to really help you with your stable platform underwater. It's not only about propulsion. So again, with propulsion, movement should be slow and deliberate. Good propulsion will help you conserve energy, which obviously makes you better on air. So if you find that you're using a little bit more air than you want, then just really focus on slowing down your movements and being more thoughtful and actually aware of what you're doing underwater. You'll probably find that you can improve your air consumption pretty quickly. It also helps stay together with your buddy. So as mentioned, that flutter kick is actually pretty powerful. So as you improve with your buoyancy, that flutter kick is just going to become more efficient, and that means you're going to be like flying away really fast, and so people may not be able to keep up with you. But it also, regardless of how good your buoyancy is, it just by nature, because of the way the wash works, it's going to stir up the bottom if you're close to the bottom. So of course that can cause issues with staying with your buddy too. So that kind of leads to the last one there, is it doesn't stir up the bottom, which I think everybody appreciates for sure. So other important things to think about when you're talking about essential skills is conduct a pre-dive safety check. Now, I didn't do a poll for this, but maybe I should have. But if I were to ask everybody, how many of you do the same buddy check that you learned in your open water course, then my guess would be a very small number of you would actually put up your hand if you're being honest. And you know, we're not fools. We see how divers dive out there. We're at the sites all the time. So what I want to do is I want to talk about how important a buddy check is. Now, if you don't want to do the begin with review and friend or whatever, however you learned it, I think that's totally fair, because I don't know if it really covers what we want to cover as divers anyway. So here's how I do my buddy checks, and you can talk to anybody that I dive with for fun, or anybody that's done any courses with me. You know, you'll see that I have a very methodical way of checking everything before we dive. So first of all, I always make sure that my air's on. So whether I do it myself or make sure that the diver that I'm diving with does that, it kind of depends on my configuration, to be honest. But nonetheless, I'm of course going to make sure that my air's on. Now, a little quick sidebar with this one is that when I have my air on, it's all the way on. And when I have my air off, it's all the way off. So we don't believe in that all the way on and a quarter turn back methodology that has been traditionally taught over the many, many years. And the reason for that is because you can have your air all the way off and a quarter turn on, and it will work, especially on the surface. But once you get down to about 15 meters or 50 feet, your pressure gauge is going to start to drop, because you're going to actually not get enough air in the hoses to continue a constant flow of air. So you'll actually, in essence, you run out of air, and then you'll actually feel like that, and then all of a sudden the hoses will fill up again with air, and then you take a breath, and then you run out of air, and it can obviously be very confusing. If the air's all the way on, then there's no question, right? It's either going to not work right away, or it's going to work right away. I always make sure that whatever my method of sharing air is, whether it's a traditional alternate air source or whether it's a long hose or whatever, that it's free and deployable. So if I've got my traditional alternate air source, then I'm going to make sure that there's nothing trapped, there's no pressure gauge or anything there. If my long hose there, I always take it off and make sure we completely deploy it before we actually go diving. So that way, if anybody needs it underwater, I know that I can effectively offer it to them, or they can grab it if they need to. So every single dive, I'll do that. I'm always familiar with my buddy's equipment configuration. Now, again, I'm pretty familiar with most configurations, so I can just scan that. But if I wasn't familiar with it, then I would talk to them about it. The other thing I do, and this is primarily mostly for shore diving, but I'll do this on the boat as well if I can, and it's not as strong water movement on the surface or currents and things. But typical shore dives, we're kind of getting ready. We're in chest deep water here. So I've got my regulator, and I'm going to actually breathe from it underwater. So I'll submerge my head right there, and I'll just take a few breaths. And what I'm doing is I'm making sure that it's breathing air, of course, because that's important. But I'm also making sure that it's not breathing water. So on the surface, I can check a regulator. I can purge the button. I can make sure that it's delivering air. But that's not going to actually verify that there's not a stick in my exhaust diaphragm, or that there's rocks in there and they've actually compromised the integrity of the regulator in such a way that it's not keeping water out. So I'm just really making sure my rig's not wet breathing. A hole in the mouthpiece is another example that might cause that. So I'll do that with my regulator, and then I'll do that with my alternate air source, or if I'm a long hose diver, then I'll do it with both regulators right like that. But nonetheless, I'm making sure that the regulator that's for me and my dive buddy are going to be working effectively. I always make sure my BCD and dry suit valves are inflating properly. So I'll push on my dry suit, I'll make sure that it dumps air right from on the surface. I'll make sure that my BCD is inflating, deflating. Common things here, we're not just making sure that it's working properly, but also especially the dry suit, we're making sure that the dry suit hose has been plugged in. So it's a pretty common mistake that people might make. Even with years and years of experience, sometimes things like that can happen. So I'm doing all of this stuff right in chest deep water, is making sure that everything's functioning that I need. I'm going to make sure my light's functioning, and I may do this right at this stage, but I'll always make sure my light's on before I descend. And I have a backup light with me all the time too, so in case there's a problem, again, depends on the type of diving. And then I ensure that I'm weighted properly for neutral buoyancy, balance, and trim. So again, if I'm looking at this shore dive scenario, then after I check my regs, after I check my BCD, all those types of things, then what I do is I just do a quick little submersion right in chest deep water, and I'm going to make sure that my weighting's proper, that I feel like I'm balanced, I can kind of move my undergarments and just get myself comfortable with my gear. I'm also going to have a pretty good indication of my dry suits keeping water out. So if my neck seals are rolled in or something, I can deal with that then, rather than doing a long surface swim and then submerging and then trying to fix a problem out in the middle of the bay or something like that. So that's my buddy check, and I do it religiously every single time I hit the water. So descents. So these are, again, really important skills. Now, most divers go through most of their energy during the descent, and you can see from this video why. People just, they're flipping upside down, they're waving their arms, they're spinning, they're all doing all sorts of challenging maneuvers trying to get underwater. And so you can see that there's a lot of disorganization there. And in fact, I just named this video Chaotic Descent. So you can also see that people aren't really communicating with their dive buddies effectively. When we get to the bottom, you're going to see that one of the guys kind of gets to the bottom, not too bad with the neutral buoyancy, but nonetheless just does a little spin, and then of course creates a big silt disturbance. So ideally, what we want to do is a more controlled descent where you're descending together, face to face. Everybody's at the same depth level. If one person has a problem, then you can deal with that problem. You're ascending and descending at the same rate with eye contact. And then I talked about having a light. So this is where I would have my light also facing towards my buddy. Of course, not right in their eyes, but just slightly down. So in areas like Vancouver, where we might not get good visibility on a consistent basis. So even if I can't see the expression on my buddy's face, sometimes I can still see their lights, and I know that we'll probably break through that that layer of plankton or whatever is causing the bad viz, and then it'll open up. But that light is basically helping us stay together. So another video, you can actually find this on our YouTube channel, I think, but I took it out just for time purposes. But what we like to teach is a 5, 15, 30 descent. And so it's a really easy concept to utilize. And again, if we put a poll out there saying, how many of you have ever gone diving with somebody, and then during the descent, they rocketed to the bottom, and then you were either taking your time, or maybe you had an issue with equalizing, or you just weren't quite ready yet. Most people would put the yes. Everybody would put up their hands and say, I've experienced that. And so the 5, 15, 30 is a technique to make sure that we can avoid these types of issues. So at 5 feet, what we do is we do a little momentary stop, and we're still looking at each other, and we do what we call a bubble check. So this is a signal for bubbles, and so I'll just take a look around, and if I don't see any crazy bubbles coming out of your gear, then we know that it's safe. And then at this point, also, if I haven't already done my chest deep kind of little weight and trim check that I do on all my dives, this is now where I would do it. So if I'm boat diving, this is my weight and trim check too. So at 5 feet, just a momentary stop, making sure everything's good, and then we carry on. And it doesn't take long. Like we just like it's we're going down, yeah, quick check, okay, and then we're down again. So it's not taking a lot of time. Now at 15 feet, what we're doing is we're taking another quick check to make sure that we're all equalizing properly. So again, during the descent, the big problem with buddy separation would be because one person can't equalize effectively. So you can equalize, I can equalize, so check, okay, now we're gonna just keep going down. And then our 30-foot is just a final check that we're doing. Yeah, we're still together, everything's good, and then at that point we can kind of start our kind of more rapid descent, so to speak, where we're getting to the depth that we're aiming for. So it's just a quick little procedure of staying together as a team, doing some checks to make sure everybody on the team is good, and then carrying on. It takes very little effort, but it does take a little bit of skill, and it's a good way to challenge you and your team members to develop good ascent, descent strategies and skills. Okay, ascents, again, big part of our dive, and proper ascents are key to safe diving and avoiding decompression sickness. Now, we're not going to get at all into decompression theory here, but one thing to discuss, if we were to talk about decompression theory, is the word theory should be heavily emphasized. There is some research, and we've actually been lucky enough to have some more recent research happen with some decompression theory concepts. But a lot of the theory is just that, it's theory. It's been in application for many years, so we know that it works. But nonetheless, we don't have a lot of things that we can tangibly say, yes, it works this way or that way. Now, the reason I kind of ramble on about that is because when we look at the 30-foot per minute ascent rate, that is actually tested, and it's not theory. That's actually been proven to be a very good ascent rate. And so, so the U.S. Navy, actually, I'll show you an example here of something else, but the U.S. Navy did studies a long time ago about different ascent rates, and they tested 10 feet per minute, 30 feet per minute, and then 60 feet per minute. And the 30 foot per minute showed the least amount of bubbling at the end of the dive. So that's the ascent rate that you should try to achieve when you're diving. Now, safety stops, of course, really important. So, the standard is 3 minutes at 10 to 20 feet. So obviously when you're first learning, they say 15 feet, and that's right in the middle of the sweet zone. So anywhere between 10 and 20 is going to be fine. I actually do mine at 20. And then if I want, I'll maybe modify or do a slow ascent from 20 to kind of add some extra time in that 10 to 20 foot range. But I find 20 feet's a good place to do it, just because if there's a little bit of surface movement, surge, those types of things, a little bit deeper is a bit better. Now, other ascent strategies that you may have heard about, so deep stops have been around for now many years, and there was a time where deep stops were strongly advocated by the certain areas of the diving community, especially the technical diving community. But this is now where some of the decompression theory is meeting the research, and some of the most recent research is actually showing that deep stops may not be as beneficial as they once were thought of. But if you're kind of interested in them, we can talk about this in another conversation, but a standard deep stop kind of concept would be basically doing a 1 minute stop at about 50%, like 50, of your deepest depth. And so if I was diving at 100 feet, then I would maybe stop at 50 feet for about 1 minute and then carry on my ascent to the surface or to my safety stop zone. So think of it as a safety stop and a safety stop. It's not really a decompression of anything stop, depending on your definition of decompression stop. But now, having said that, we don't really advocate deep stops any longer based on the most recent research, but I can give maybe one valid reason to consider deep stops, in that it just helps you control your ascent rate. So if you're still kind of working on things a little bit and you want to practice, then maybe making that momentary stop just halfway through is just really making sure that you can stop and that your neutral buoyancy and your ascent rate is manageable. So certainly that's fine. And in the reality, even though the research has shown that deep stops maybe not as good as we thought they were, I don't think they're causing any major problems as well. The most important thing is just keep them short, like 1 minute. If you start doing extended deep stops, and that's not a deep stop anymore, it's just carrying on your dive, and there will be some on-gassing, significant on-gassing to your tissues and so forth. Now, more important advice, I think, if we were to offer you as far as your ascent strategies go, would be to extend your safety stops. So 3 minutes, kind of what we all have been taught, but especially if you're doing a slightly deeper dive within those stop limits, then still extending that safety stop to 5 minutes would be very, very valuable. So whether you do that deliberately and you have to actually stop on a line or something and spend that extra time, that's fine. Or maybe you're just in the shallows kind of looking at the eelgrass and the schools of fish that we see sometimes in the shallow water here, then you can get lost and maybe spend 10, 15 minutes at that depth, whatever works for you. But by making a deliberate decision that you want to spend a bit more time in the shallows, you're going to definitely find some real benefits from an off-gassing standpoint. So here's a chart that's going to demonstrate a little bit of this concept to you. So this chart is taken from Deco for Divers, which is written by a guy named Mark Powell. He is an instructor, technical diving instructor that's based out of the UK, very well known around the world. He does guest speakers. You may have seen some of his webinars in the recent times when webinars now are very trendy. Anyway, so this is kind of just a clip of a written kind of account of another US Navy study that they did based on safety stops. And so what you'll see here is on the left axis there on the top, you're basically seeing Doppler bubble readings, which essentially is an ultrasound reading. And what the Doppler does is it'll measure the noise that it hears in your blood vessels. And so the more bubbles you have, the more noisy more noise it'll pick up. So then it has a numeral reference to that. So then the bottom is just minutes, and that's minutes on the surface. So then this is all from surface after surfacing. So these divers did 3 different types of descents. They did a direct ascent. They did an ascent that had a 2-minute stop at 3 meters or 15 feet. And then they did a final version of an ascent where they did 1 minute at 20 meters, or sorry, 6 meters or 20 feet, and then 4 meters at 3 meters or 15 feet. So when we look at the direct ascent, so we look at this light gray here, you can see that there was a reasonable amount of extra bubbling happening in our vessels, and then as we spend time on the surface, of course, it off gases. But even after 2 hours on the surface, relatively speaking, there's still a significant amount of bubbling that's being detected here. And so these divers were still asymptomatic, which means there's no decompression sickness or anything. Nobody had to visit the chamber, but this is still the result of not doing any safety stop. So then after only 2 minutes here at 15 feet, you can see that the number of bubbles drops significantly in this dark gray area. But then as we go along, we can see that we're still getting some off-gassing, but at 120 minutes on the surface, we're still having some residual nitrogen in our system. So then the final one, when they essentially, I'm just going to say they did a 5-minute safety stop versus, stopping here and there, whatever. I don't know if the depths really matter a whole lot. But after doing a 5-minute stop, you'll notice that, again, there wasn't a significant drop in the nitrogen compared to the 2-minute stop. But after 45 minutes, they don't notice any residual nitrogen. So the benefits of that longer surface or longer safety stop, sometimes will come on the surface interval side where you'll off gas more efficiently, and especially if you're doing repetitive dives, then obviously you're going to go into the next dive a lot cleaner. So extending those safety stops, and it's amazing, even 1 or 2 or 3 minutes makes when you're doing this. Now, I think the other significant thing to take out of this chart is the fact that there's a spike here. And so if you notice at 15 minutes, we're spiking here with no safety stop. We actually even have a little bit of a spike after the shorter safety stop. But nonetheless, the point being is that you're actually still creating a lot of nitrogen, and it's off-gassing, and it's still ready to spike after you surface. And so that habit that some divers have of getting out of the water and then immediately climbing up a hill or start carrying a bunch of gear, or I see instructors taking heavy floats and so forth and then kind of bringing them back to the van. even climbing out of the water on a boat, so you're exerting that energy and that effort, you're really just giving yourself even more of a spike of nitrogen, and therefore you are putting yourself potentially at more risk of having a decompression problem, especially if you're kind of close to those limits. Now, most of us dive well within limits, and so it may not be an issue, but again, it's just one of those things to think about. I know that after a technical dive, the divers that I dive with, we basically all spend, at least 5 or 10 minutes on the shallows, just kind of recapping the dive. We'll discuss highlights. We might discuss things that we could have done better as a team and so forth. We'll relive the octopus sighting that we may have had, and and so forth. But we're kind of still creating or taking a look and seeing that safety or that surface point as kind of our part of our safety stop, or our last decompression stop. All right, quick video again. So this is just another video of just a nice slow ascent, and there's going to be a little safety stop here as well. We won't do the whole safety stop, I promise. But you can see that one of the things when you're ascending is that you should always have a reference. So in this case, we just have an SMB and spool set up. So I'm using that line as a reference. But if I didn't have that, then I would make sure I'm on a wall or a slopey bottom or something. So a reference on your ascent is really important. It'll help you make a more controlled ascent. If I had a team that I was diving with there, then of course they would be in front of me in the right position. But also notice how slow it is, how controlled it is. It's really all about making sure that you feel comfortable, during the whole time. And then here we're ready to stop, and there's no excessive movement to stop. So basically, during your descents, during your ascents, during your underwater time, you're essentially neutrally buoyant the whole time. And we're just changing depth levels based on a little bit of movement from the fins or from your lungs. But you're essentially neutral, so you can stop at any depth at any time. All right, so let's take a quick look at equipment. So we're not going to go through everything, but just talk a little bit about specialized equipment that we'd recommend for divers. And this is, again, kind of from that foundations concept. So long hose configuration. So if you decide to go to that YouTube channel, and you can see kind of our discussion about different types of air sharing options and configurations. The long hose configuration is without question the best when it comes to sharing air. You have lots of room between you and the diver. Divers can swim on either side of you. There's a lot of control, but it does take a little bit of skill and instruction to manage that long hose. So it's important to still get some proper training and so forth. You have to also realize that you're taking the regulator out of your mouth to share air. So you have to be comfortable with that concept and practice, and making sure that you can effectively find the other one that you're breathing from. Finger spool and surface marker buoy. So this has certainly become a standard in diving now over the last 10 or 15 years, but before that it wasn't. And so it just gives you an easy access to a reference. So if you're ever in a situation where, you're on a drift dive and maybe you get kind of pushed off the wall or something, then you can deploy an SMB and you can follow that line up with easy reference. Or you can also alert the surface team that's where you are. So if they're on a boat or they're following you or something. We were talking a little bit about that wreck scenario where somebody's trying to swim to that upline. Well, instead of making it to upline, they can just send up an SMB wherever they are, and then they can come up that, and then they don't have to worry about running out of air, because they can do that with from any point on their dive while they have enough air to manage that. A primary and a backup light. So I don't think we can put enough emphasis on how important lights are. Obviously, we use them for the enjoyment of the dive. If you want to look inside a crevice and find an octopus den or something, it brings out all the colors of the marine life. So those are all real good benefits of having a good light. But we also see that we use it as a team diving principle, and being able to communicate and maintain effective contact with everybody with lights and light communication is really, really important. We would consider a light like mandatory for deep dives for sure. Like it doesn't matter again on a recreational or technical platform, but without question, a light for deep dive is really, really, really important. I had a dive a couple of years ago where the person I was diving with, I think we might have been doing a training thing, but you know, his light failed, and I don't think he had a backup, and then my light didn't work, and so I ended up giving him my backup. And anyway, I ended up having no light for the whole dive, and it was probably the most boring dive I've ever had, just because there's literally everything looks brown underwater or gray. It doesn't. There's nothing interesting about it. So for no other reason, you want to have it for those purposes, but the other benefits definitely will be there. I also realized on that dive that fish don't have lights. So that's what they see all the time. So, you know, you always think that what we're diving and what we see is what the fish see, you know, throughout their whole life, but they don't. They see darkness. It's kind of weird when you think about it. One of those underwater moments, you know. All right, suiting up for redundancy. So there's a lot of different ways you can have some redundancy. So again, you know, we're talking about life support equipment. It's very reliable, but you know, there is a chance that it can fail, like hoses can rupture, O-rings can go. So double tanks is one option. Obviously, this might be a bit extreme for some people, so that's fine. So, but it is an option for people. You can get them in different sizes. So, so we have some people that dive small little double 80s, and then you know most people dive double 100s, and then some people, if you're a pretty big person, might get 120 or 130 foot cylinders as a very heavy. Side mount configuration, and of course we've all seen this now, is very, very popular. Really easy way to have redundancy. So you've got two separate cylinders, they're not connected. So you have to balance the amount of gas you keep in each cylinder. That's all done through your training, but nonetheless you always have that redundancy, which is really comforting. I think that's probably the most biggest comments we get from people sometimes when they go to like a doubles or side mount configuration is, first, they have lots of air and they really feel comfortable about that, but they also just feel like, you know, the ability to have that redundant source, even though having a big equipment problem underwater is rare. And then finally, and this is one that's manageable and easy for anybody to achieve, is just carrying what we call a stage bottle or a pony bottle. Sometimes you might call it a sling bottle. Now, this is again where you might want to get some advice before you make any purchases, because there's certain sizes that probably are so small that they're too insignificant to give you any real time underwater. And then, of course, you know, there's sizes that might be too big for what you want to do. In general, we would suggest a 40 cubic foot cylinder, and you carry it on the side. And you'd be surprised at how easy and how light it is. It's completely neutral underwater, and you know, lots of people that do this take pictures and do all sorts of things, carry gear, and it doesn't get in their way at all. At minimum, probably 30 cubic feet. I don't know if I would say minimum 19, but 40 is going to give you kind of the best of everything, and you're not going to notice the difference between a 40 and a 30 cubic foot from a physical standpoint, you know, when you're carrying it. So you might as well get that little bit of extra air. And then if you do progress as a diver and get into other areas of diving where you want to now convert that from a kind of like a redundant gas source to a decompression bottle, then 40 cubic feet would be the standard for that. So you wouldn't have to repurchase anything. Anyway, so that's good. And you obviously, again, need to learn how to carry it, how to deploy it, you know, how to use it for its purpose. Backup mask. So mask straps can break, you know, different things can happen. So making sure you have that. Now, again, in the training standpoint, you know, carrying a backup mask is only really part of the solution. If you never go and practice retrieving that backup mask in underwater, then it's pretty useless to you, because when you actually need it, you know, the first time you're going to be practicing is the first time you're actually needing it, and you're going to have no mask, and you might be in an already stressful situation. So that's not beneficial. So, you know, if you're going to start to carry some of these things, make sure that you practice and use them occasionally. Also making sure that your backup mask actually works for you. It's not just like a crappy old mask that you found but doesn't fit you really well, but you know, it doesn't matter because I'm never using it. In fact, I'll actually switch my backup masks and my primary masks all the time, so kind of make sure that my backup mask works, and it just gives me, you know, comfort with whichever mask, which for me, I would have the same mask anyway. So, but if I had two different ones, then I would be used to it. And then I think finally we have a backup dive computer. So of course, we recommend that everybody has two Perdixes or two Shearwater computers, but a backup computer can be, anything that that you have. But you will find, of course, we all now rely on our dive computers while we're diving. And so most people, aren't really accounting for the fact that, these are electronic instruments, they're battery operated, so they will fail at some point. Even the most reliable and good reputation computer manufacturers will occasionally have problems. And so if this happens underwater, then you need to have an easy way to bail yourself out. And so a backup computer is definitely the ideal way to do it. Your kind of backup to your backup could be your dive buddy, which again kind of emphasizes the point of team diving and making sure that you stay connected with that person. Now, the other thing is if you're ever traveling, this can also save a dive trip for you too, because if you have a computer fail and you don't have a backup, then it's going to be hard to continue your diving for the rest of your trip without one. And maybe you have to rent one, or maybe you have to borrow one or whatever. But if it's not yours, then you're not really familiar with it, and it does become a bit of a distraction while you're underwater. All right, so let's that kind of covers a lot of foundation stuff. So now we'll take a look at team diving. We're getting close to the end, so this is a bit shorter than the other part. I hope you're all still with me here. But if you're not, that's fine. I'm having fun. So anyway, so team diving versus buddy diving. So we've all learned about buddy diving when we took our very first open water course. But the problem with buddy diving is there's not a lot of strategy often interpreted into that. And so when we're diving with a buddy, we kind of arrive to the site at the same time. Maybe we even kind of gear up together at the same time, but I'm ready before you are, so I'm just going to head down to the water and then wait for you there. And then as you come down, now I've already got my fins on, and you're kind of on the log, and now I'm swimming out, and so we're just never cohesive. And then when we decide to go down, then I just give you this signal, and then I rock it down to the bottom, and then hopefully we reunite on the bottom. And so what we want to do as a team diver is we want to kind of clean this up a little bit. And so you'll find that team diving, although we have strategies and it kind of formalizes the dive, it's not designed to be militant. But it is designed to be a little bit more structured, and you'll find that at the end of the day, if you put these principles into place with the other people you're diving with, that you'll find that the diving actually becomes less stressful, and you're going to be more focused on the diving. And the reason for that is because the team will work more cohesively. And I know, again, we've all experienced these things where we're swimming along, and all of a sudden we look around, we can't see our buddy anywhere, and now we're spinning around and trying to figure out where they are and backtracking and so forth. And maybe we find them underwater, but that still has interrupted your rhythm for the dive, or maybe you haven't, and then now you have to go to the surface and reunite. So this is what we're trying to avoid. But there's also a significant safety side to things. And as you can see on this slide, that same Dan fatality workshop that we addressed earlier also showed that 40% of diving fatalities happen during a period of buddy separation, and 14% involve declared solo dives. Now, of course, there's not a lot of outside information here. Were the solo divers trained in solo diving and had redundant gear, or were they just regular divers with very little experience diving on their own? We don't really have that information here. But nonetheless, it does show that there's a trend that when you're diving with somebody, it's safer than when you're not. And if you can stay together as a team, then that's safer than if you get separated underwater. And that's kind of what we're trying to achieve here. So the difference between team diving and buddy diving essentially is, like I said, it's basically taking buddy diving to the next level. So as a good team diver, we're going to discuss the plan with our buddy. So plan, depth, and time are pretty standard. Which part of the sites we're going to dive are pretty standard, but you might also address things like, what happens if the current changes direction, or if we experience a current but we're not expecting one. What are we going to do to evolve that? So you can have some quick discussions on the surface, and then good communication underwater. Oops. what should you do if you get separated? So again, resorting back to our initial training, we all know the answer to this. We should search for a minute and then ascend. But I know I've had a number of experiences where divers have disappeared on me, and they didn't come to the surface. So I go to the surface and I'm basically waiting for them, and they don't show up. And so, so making sure that you kind of cement those ideas and those concepts there. There's one time I had the guy, and we're both instructors, and you know, he's a bit more of an old school diver. This was quite a few years ago now, and you know, he did a headfirst descent, and then basically as soon as he got to the bottom, he was on his dive, and then I got down there, and then I really couldn't find him, so I went back to the surface. I tried to find his bubbles. I went back down, and then I went up, and so I said, okay, well, I guess he's not coming up now. And I thought, okay, well, I'm sure he's fine. So I was just more kind of waiting and waiting and waiting, and thought he would come up eventually, and then still never came up. And then, you know, I started to get more frustrated and maybe even a little bit angry, and then waited and waited and waited. And then after about 30 minutes, then I started getting worried. And I'm thinking, do I phone somebody or not? I'm still on the surface, basically waiting. We had a long surface swim to get back to the shore from where we descended. And so finally he pops up and he goes, hey, you know, that was a great dive and everything. And I was like, oh, I'm glad that you had a great dive. I was just about to call the Coast Guard. And he goes, oh, well, I didn't think that that would be an issue. I didn't have to worry about you. And so I said, well, yeah, but well, we have to worry about each other. So that's kind of what it's about. And so that was the last time he's ever done that. So he did have a good learning experience from it. But, you know, it's just one of those things. And you go through all the different emotions when somebody does that. So it's so easy to fix just by having that little discussion ahead of time and having that agreement. And then we spent lots of time now. I'm not going to review any more out of air situations, but making sure, of course, that's part of your team diving, is making sure that you can be comfortable with that. We like to say that you stay with your buddy from the parking lot or the boat to the underwater and back to the parking lot to the boat. So we descend, we don't descend, we walk down to the beach together, we walk back to from the beach together. And, you know, again, these are little things like, you know, let's say, you know, you walk down to the beach and then I'm back up on the parking lot and I'm putting my gear on, and then my regulator kind of gets tucked in behind my back in my BCD or something, and I'm trying to grab it, and eventually I have to take all my gear off just to grab that and then put it all back on. You know, if you were there, you could have helped me, but while you're waiting for me there, now you're at the beach and now you're getting overheated in your dry suit, and you know, we're just basically starting the whole thing off on the wrong foot because I'm frustrated and having to go through this effort and just with myself, and then you're getting overheated or whatever. So if we stay together, then, you know, it creates that social part, and that's what diving's about, but also there's that practical part as well. Descend, staying together and at the same depth level all the time. We got our 5, 15, 30 descent. Planning proper configurations for descents and ascents, using your lights to stay together. So here's a couple little diagrams that show how we like to descend and ascend. So if I have a team of 3 divers, then we're all in that triangular formation. We can see each other. We're all at the same depth level, and our lights are shining in each other's general direction, so we can see each other that way. And of course, if I have 2 divers, then I'm there. And then if we're diving underwater, a couple good configurations to use. So this one here we call the cascade configuration. So in that case, let me just see, do you guys lose the screen or something? Oh, we'll take a look at some comments here at the end. Let's see. So cascade position. So I've got you know, a wall here or something, and then this is the lead diver, and then, you know, they all the other divers kind of fall into place behind them on the same side as the wall, which means that this diver only, the lead diver, get my arrow back here, this lead diver only needs to look one direction to see everybody, which is very, very comforting and useful for them. Also, they don't have to spin around each time to communicate, so I can shine my light back here, I can give a little okay sign, and then everybody can okay back. So it's a very, very effective way of diving together. Wing on wing is pretty self-explanatory, and kind of get that terminology from wearing our winged BCDs, I suppose. So this person, even though they have to turn either way to see the other diver, they're really just right on their shoulders, and their lights are shining forward, so I can see the two lights right in front of me, so I know that the divers are there. And if they need my attention, they just wave their light, and then they've got it. The staggered position, so each diver just has to turn in one direction to see the other two divers, and again, light communication is effective. And then this final one where we say avoid the blind spot, this is what we want to avoid, and this is what inevitably that person that goes missing, where we always end up finding them. So they're usually right behind you, or maybe right behind you and just above you. So you're spinning around this way and that way, and you can't see them, and finally you look up, and then there they are. And if they're not there, sometimes they're on the surface because they've lost control of their ascent, or their buoyancy. But nonetheless, so that's what we want to avoid, is that blind spot. The other ways are pretty effective though. So discussing the role of each buddy during the dive. Now, on basic dives, there's not a lot of roles. We're just diving. So, but we know that we have a bottom part of the dive. We know we have an ascent part of the dive. So, having one person kind of take control of the bottom, they're gonna make sure they maintain the depth. They're gonna navigate. They're gonna decide when to turn the dive. Those types of things. And then the other diver is going to ascend. And maybe they're going to control the safety stop or something like that. And so what you want to do to create a strong team of divers, especially if you're diving with the same people all the time, is you want to switch the roles so everybody gets a chance to kind of play the different roles. So what we often see out there is we often see groups of people where there's an alpha diver and then there's everybody else. And that alpha diver just happens to be the person that's been diving the longest. They know the site the best. They have the most experience. Maybe they have the highest certification. But they end up taking control over the dive every single time they go diving. So everybody else is just a passenger. They're not really gaining a lot of experience. So if you can pull yourself out of that alpha role and say, okay, now it's your turn to lead the dive, and I'll do the ascent and so forth, and we'll keep switching things around, then that builds a strong team. And that's, again, the whole purpose of a team, is that everybody can play the different roles and can accomplish the objectives. So really good advice. We see that all the time, and we had lots of groups where we tell them, start to switch out the roles a little bit, and then you can see everybody else starts to benefit from that experience. So here's it's a very, very short video, so you'll have to look as soon as I click on it, but just a quick example of somebody communicating during a transitional point. So transitional points of your dives are basically your descents, your turn points, your ascents. Anytime that you're going to change the kind of movement of the dive itself, so stopping and starting. You want to communicate to all the team members when those things happen, because that's when miscommunication usually occurs. I just give a general, hey, let's all turn around, and then I start heading back the other way. I just assume everybody saw that, but meanwhile they're there. So now I'm separated from the team, for example. So this diver, he's going to communicate to everybody. He's going to give the little up signal here. And it just shows very good communication. You can see they're all at the same depth level, so really easy to communicate and see. And then he's even giving me the up signal, which I appreciate because usually I get ignored on dives. So thank you for that. And one of the things we talk about just with the same depth level, so communication is easy, but also if there's any emergency situations, so like let's say this person's out of air, they don't have to change buoyancy or do anything to access the other divers, vice versa. Whereas if the divers are kind of at different depth levels, well then if this diver has to change depth to get to another diver for assistance, that also means, of course, they're changing their buoyancy, and so it's going to be more challenging, especially when you're task loaded or stressed because of the emergency. So that's just what I said there. So also be within 2 to 3 seconds of each diver. So just nice, good close contact. You want to ascend together. So here's another example of some just divers that we have in a class. And you can see them ascending together in a nice formation. You can see some communication. You can see the lights out there. There's 2 groups of divers here, actually. And so there's kind of maybe I'll call them 2 teams of divers, but 1 group. So we kind of have different definitions. So a team is basically the people that you're having to be focused on in the dive. So these 2 people would be like a buddy team. And then the other 2 people that you saw slightly above them would also be a buddy team. But they still might choose to dive as a group. And so a group would be the 4 people, but you have to kind of, again, this communication and dive planning. If we're diving as a group, I'm still responsible for the person I'm diving with, and then they're still responsible for the people they're diving with. And we might have a goal to stay together as a group, but ultimately we'd have to decide if that group gets separated, is that the same as team separation? Or if that group gets separated, do we just go on our own? And so, you know, we decide that as we go along, or maybe we're diving as a group and we can see the conditions make it really challenging for us to stay together. So we might just give each other that kind of like, hey, see you later signal, and then we'll make a deliberate decision to separate. But if you are diving as a group, the comment I would have for these people is that the group should also be ascending together like that, so it maintains that group separation, so or connection. So even though both teams were actually doing a really nice ascent together, just again, that adds another skill set to work on, is now breaking that awareness and communication outside of your own team to other people and matching, you know, your buoyancy and so forth there. So here there's no specific light communication. There's only a couple signals that we actually practice with lights, you know, the big round okay, and then basically back and forth for I need your attention, and back and forth even faster if it's more of an emergency. But you can still see the effectiveness of using a light just to stay together. It's kind of more informal communication here, where we're just shining our lights in general towards people. This is probably a day dive, just happens to be a little bit deeper, but you can see the value of really good lights there, because they really just put right through the water. But you can see too, we can see the cloud sponge and whatever else is kind of hiding in there more effectively as well. All right, another poll. This is to wake you up. Let's see. Okay. So what's the maximum size a dive team should be? So we're talking about a dive team, not a group. And then how should you, where should you be if your diving is having troubles equalizing? All right, wow, a bit more of a mix of answers on this one. So and nobody chose one. I guess that's good for team diving. So the maximum size a dive team should be is 3. So 2 or 3 people per team. So again, remember, we're kind of thinking of a team as a buddy team. So if you have 4 people diving together, then you would have 2 teams of 2. So that still might be one group, but 2 teams. And so then at that point, you decide whether you're going to stay together or not. Or if you have, you know, 5 people, then you're gonna have a team of 2 and a team of 3. You have 6 people, you have 2 teams of 3. So that would be the most effective kind of way to organize. Now, we sometimes say that ideal size team is a team of 3, which for some people, they might find that not really comfortable, because, you know, you're used to diving with a buddy. And so it's easy to keep track of one person, but sometimes you add that one other person in the mix, and then you know, it adds that little bit of complication. But the reason why 3 people is a better team than 2, at least in some situations, is that you have now more resources to the divers if you need help. So if I'm out of air and I go to somebody, then I've got 2 people to go to. So let's say, you know, for some reason that other person isn't handling the situation, or we're going through, even though we planned gas reserves a little bit to, we planned it well, but we're still going through the gas faster because of stress or whatever, then we can just trade over to that other 3rd person, and then they've got a whole set of other gas reserve that we can share. Or if we don't have any issues with air supply, but you know, that 3rd person isn't stressed or as task loaded as we are, so they can actually maintain better referencing. They know where the shore is, they know where the boat line is, you know, for the upline or whatever, so they can keep track of things better. So again, this is all part of discussions and training and so forth. It doesn't happen naturally. We have to actually deliberately kind of be aware of these little roles that we have in different situations, but that's where the team of 3 might come in. Now, if your buddy's having problems equalizing, then majority of you agree that you should be at the same depth level as them, and that would be certainly the case. You want to make sure that you're there, and so that way, if you have to go to the surface, it's not going to be too far to go to the surface. Nobody's wasting their gas. nobody's going through adding more decompression time to their bottom time, and then obviously you can maintain together and you can keep help the person if they need it. All right, so it's just a quick summary of team diving principles. So we want to maintain awareness of our team members. So where are they? You know, we're going to look at their gas supply. So you should have a good idea of what, how much gas your team divers have. And sometimes too, like, and this is, again, this is part of that awareness, is who goes through the air the fastest or who's the best on air. So that helps, you know, where you're going to turn the dive and so forth. So you need to make sure that you balance all of those things. So know where they are throughout the dive, know what the roles of each team member, and as mentioned, you know, it can be as simple as bottom, you know, someone's controlling the bottom, someone's controlling ascent. You know, if you're doing a research kind of project, then, you know, everybody might have tasks. I've done some different things where we're doing some video or camera work or whatever. So, you know, while the talented people are using their videos and cameras, you know, my job might be just to maintain awareness to the dive, making sure that we're not getting disoriented, making sure that the video camera or the photographer isn't losing track of, you know, their gas consumption, those types of things, because people can get a bit task fixated. Make sure your equipment is streamlined and your team members' equipment is streamlined and functioning properly. So if you see something dangling, then give them a hand. I've seen, again, a lot of times where people have an octopus kind of just floating on the bottom, and they don't really know that that's happening because they probably fix it, but then you see everybody else that does see it not say anything to that diver, and keeping in mind that that octopus actually is your regulator, they just happen to be carrying it for you, so you probably want to be proactive. So if you ever do need it, you're not going to get a mouthful of sand and dirt, and instead you'll get air. Make sure your team member will be able to donate efficiently in case you need it. So as mentioned, my pre-dive check is to make sure that I can donate air, but I want to make sure that the person I'm diving with can donate air to me as well. And that's it for team diving. So I'm going to finish off with a few little some last minute tips, I guess, that we have for safer diving. So this is kind of a summary of a lot of things we talked about and maybe a few other things. But in general, if you kind of follow all of these points, that you'll find that diving is safer, and ultimately it's going to be a lot more fun. So as discussed before, we want to balance training and experience. You want to stay within the limits of your training and experience. So again, we can kind of analyze a lot of diving accidents where people are going beyond their training or experience and getting themselves into trouble. Now, in I would say almost all of these cases that I know of, it's people actually deliberately doing this. So it's not like you actually end up going beyond your training experience by accident and get yourself into trouble. It's people making a decision to do something that they know they probably shouldn't be doing. So that makes it even more tragic sometimes when things like that occur. Master your buoyancy skills. Master propulsion techniques, develop good situational awareness, and so this happens through training and experience. So a lot of times what we try to do is kind of just keep edging you through this level of awareness as you go through. And one of the things that we acknowledge when we're looking at kind of the 4 pillars that we talk about for foundations of diving, which would be buoyancy, trim, propulsion, and then the final one is awareness, is that as you're going through that progression, that your mental focus and energy should start to gradually get more and more outwards versus inwards. So if you think about a brand new diver, you know, 80% of their mental focus is inwards because they're focused on their buoyancy and they're basically trying to survive and kind of learn how to maneuver in the water and those types of things. So as you master those things and those become second nature, then your mental energy now can start to head outwards. And so those are ways that you can do that. And so through training, we'll even try to add little things like task loading, like SMB deployment or other things that will kind of help you develop those skills and kind of gently push your awareness and your abilities as you go through. Practice team diving principles. So we just spent a bit of time on that. We talked about communicating through transition points with your buddy. Move as little as possible. So a little saying we have here is the best divers move the least. So you can tell a good diver when they look like a painted picture in the water, so they're not moving at all. Avoid overexertion and know how to handle overexertion if it does occur. So obviously we talked about overexertion and its relationship to CO2. So you try to avoid those situations. But if I'm in a strong current or something, then my brain kicks in. It says, okay, I'm in a current, and then I start to focus on my breathing and really keep it slow and methodical, rather than just kind of reacting to the environment and shortening my breathing, going through my air faster and retaining CO2. If I need to, or if we need to as a team, we might even, grab something and try to relax a little bit and deal with it and make a decision on how we're going to continue on. Always have a reference during all parts of your dives. So your descents, your ascents, and while you're diving on the bottom. So using the wall, the bottom, the upline or downline, SMB with spool. And one of the things, like we often locally here, we have a bottom for a reference. And so I always tell people that, if you're 10 feet off the bottom, then that's not really a reference for you anymore, because your brain's not really looking at it with enough detail to know whether you're going up or down a little bit and so forth. So if that bottom's a reference, then you should be about 3 feet or 1 meter off that bottom in most cases. Same thing with the wall. I'm going to be close to the wall. If I start to drift too far away from it, then it's not going to be a reference anymore. Other little tips that, again, more happen in training, but I always turn into my references as well. So if the wall is over here and I want to change directions from this way to this way, then I'm going to spin, and this is my head here, I'm going to spin towards the wall this way rather than going back away from the wall. There's a couple of good reasons. Obviously, I'm maintaining visual reference all the time, but the other thing is that as soon as my fins hit this way, then I'm going to probably start kicking stuff off that wall. And a lot of the marine life that we dive here, like cloud sponge and so forth, pretty sensitive. And it might seem like all of this stuff is common sense, but we see all the time that it's not. So we bring up these details only because they're worth bringing up, and then it's sometimes just that little statement, right? And now people start to change the way they dive a little bit. Perform slow ascents and extend your safety stops. And then don't dive deep until you've mastered, so don't dive deep until you have proper training and you've mastered buoyancy control and you have a reasonable breathing rate. So use the advanced open water course as an example here. So the advanced course, the way I look at it, is an experience program. It's designed to give you some instruction. You're obviously going to learn a little bit more about how to navigate. If you do the buoyancy dive, you're going to have a little bit more instruction on how to maintain good buoyancy. But the deep dive itself, obviously has some instruction on how to dive to 100 feet or 30 meters or slightly less. But it also, though, isn't necessarily that ticket to get back down to that depth. So, if you have a good instructor, then they should give you advice after that dive and say, hey, you know what, you did really well. You should feel comfortable at those depths, no problem. But if you struggled a little bit, then they should say, okay, you know what, now that you have that experience, what you would ideally do is you want to work on your buoyancy a little bit, or maybe you went through your air a little bit too fast. So you want to work on your air consumption a tiny bit. And then you can dive to 60 feet a couple times, and then dive to 70 feet a couple times, and then dive to 80 feet, and you kind of work your way back to that depth once you start to have all these things in place. So one of the things that we always want to make sure people know is that taking a course or getting a certification doesn't deem you an expert in that area. It gives you the tools to practice and get better, with that. And maybe now you get the initial practice with an instructor, and now you don't need that instructor there, but you still need to be reasonable with how far you're pushing things. We see the same thing with rec training all the time, using a reel and doing all these things can be very complicated. And so going out and practicing outside of the overhead environment, over and over, and getting more second nature to that is just going to make you better and more skilled. And that's what it's all about. It's a good idea for all divers to become rescue divers. You're going to find that the type of awareness you develop as a rescue diver, especially to other people, is very valuable. It does actually bring out a lot of confidence in the people that take the course. There is some self-rescue kind of aspects to it as well, which obviously can be very valuable. And the interesting thing about it is in most cases, you won't break 30 or 40 feet And even in those cases, you don't spend much more than 20 or 30 minutes in the whole course underwater. Depends on how effective you are finding things. But so it's not really a diving course where you're doing a lot of underwater stuff. It's very scenario based, and there's some surface stuff, there's some egress stuff with divers and so forth. But the type of experience and awareness and confidence that people get in that course is very, very high, and we think that it's probably one of the best courses that PADI has out there for sure. Use good fitting, maintains equipment that's suitable for local diving. Another really important one, we see this all the time where people want to go out and use specialized equipment without the training. So receive training. If you're going to start to carry a bottle, then get some training for it. If you're going to want to convert to a long hose and get some training, you want to decide that you want to try using doubles and get some training. And one of the things to know is that you don't always have to take a course. Training isn't mean always a certification. And so we actually have a number of little kind of mini sessions that we do with people that we just have that are one-day sessions, or maybe even a pool session that will introduce people to some of these ideas so they can go ahead and practice and utilize them safely. So we have like an intro to doubles program that we do. We have like a long hose program that we do, for example. So those are all things that people can look into if they're wanting to get into that more specialized area. If you have any medical conditions that interfere with safe diving, then make sure that you're on top of that. So get checkups, maybe if you need to start working out or change some lifestyle things, and go for it. And finally, we have some courses that we recommend, give you kind of an overall well-rounded aspect to diving. So we've talked a bit about this foundations of diving specialty, and as mentioned, this is just really kind of cutting the surface to most of it. Obviously doesn't have any of the practical training that we do, but we do run the program on a pretty frequent basis, so you can get in touch with us if you're interested. It does seem like the ocean might open soon, we're hoping. Self-reliant diver. So a lot of people might look at this as a dive solo kind of course, but obviously you can tell our philosophy is more about team diving than diving independently. But we do believe that you're actually a better team diver if you are self-reliant. So even though some people might take the course from us with diving independently in mind, and that's fine, it's a personal choice. But we're also going to integrate a little bit of team aspect to self-reliant diving. We also, most importantly, I think this is a great course to learn how to handle carrying a 40 cubic foot cylinder, because we spend a lot of time on the handling and clipping and unclipping, deploying all these little incidentals. And what we do is we look at that as a base skill. So if you start to progress again into other areas of diving where you're going to carry a 40, like technical diving, we're going to teach you the same way there that you would learn as a technical diver on how to handle that bottle. So you're not relearning anything or having to change any of your procedures and so forth. We talked about the PADI rescue course. We talked about peak performance buoyancy, and then another one, because deep diving can be more serious. Obviously, there's a lot more to consider when you're diving a little bit deeper. And the deep specialty is more or less designed to take you down to that 30 or 40 meter range, I suppose, or 120, 130 feet. So taking a deep diver specialty course before you start diving deep would be really good. And like I said, we would spend some time looking at your regular buoyancy and basic diving skills, as well as the objective of taking you deep, and give you good, honest advice on where you're at as a diver, and whether deep diving is something that you can do right away when you're in the course, or whether there's some things that you want to practice. So there's lots more to discuss, believe it or not. But these skills and principles take a lot of practice and discipline, but the reward is safer and more enjoyable diving. So at this point, I thank you very much for persevering and participating in this webinar. It was a lot of fun for us to put it together, and certainly a lot of fun for us to offer it to you right now. And I have no idea how long it's been going. So let's see. Yeah, 2 hours. So if you're still there, I appreciate it. If anybody wants to hang around, I'm happy to maybe take a look at some questions. And if not, you can certainly head on, and you know where we are. So if you want to ask questions individually or whatever, by all means.